Good morning and welcome to the February 14th, 2021 Explorers Forum, during which Sue Linderman will lead us in the sixth and final segment of the series, Racism in America, the History We Didn't Learn in School. Before we begin, let's open with a prayer written by Reverend Dr. David Weber of the United Methodist Church. Let us pray. How do we begin, Lord of all things new? How do we begin to build a new world, new relationships, new understandings? How do we start over and build a community of acceptance, a world of diversity, a family of trust? Shall we begin with confession, with lament and sorrow? Of course, we have, and we will continue to confess our deepest sin of hatred and division. Among us, until all among us realize how divided we are, how unjust we are, how broken we all are. But surely there are beginnings to be made, words to be spoken, work to be done. Surely there are ways to see with new eyes, brothers and sisters who are different and yet the same. How do we begin, God of second chances? Let it begin with me. Amen.
Amen.
Sue, thank you for helping us think about beginning to create a new world.
Thank you all so much for being part of this Racism in America series as we have explored together the history that we didn't learn in school. As we have seen during our time together, much of the racial turmoil in our country today can be traced directly to elements of this history, even before the founding of the United States. Many of the racial stereotypes that we hear or hold are a direct consequence of intentional economic and public policy and cultural beliefs that have no grounding in genetics. Other countries with similarly sordid racial pasts have sought to move forward by a process called truth and reconciliation. And we know that America is in desperate need of such a process. So we have together embarked on a search for more truth. Much of it is painful, especially for those of us who profess that all people are children of God, that we are good people who seek justice and peace. I hope this time together has been meaningful for you as it has been for me. Today, we will look to the future to use our deeper understanding of our country's history to shape our future actions as we seek truth and peace and justice for all. To quickly recap our class last week, we looked at voter suppression then and now. We reviewed the legal history of voting rights in America, beginning with the Declaration of Independence, where Thomas Jefferson profoundly said that the power to govern is based on the consent of the governed, and that is accomplished by our vote. We looked at the 15th Amendment that sought to ensure that Black male citizens then could vote, and what happened at the end of Reconstruction. We looked at 100 years of voter suppression tactics that were restrained in large part by passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but then the action taken in 2013 in the Supreme Court decision of Shelby County v. Holder, where much of that progress was reversed. And as a consequence, we looked at the current assault on voting rights, voter ID laws, voting roll purges, limitation of resources. And during all of this, we asked ourselves, what should be the role of government when it comes to voting? Should it be to facilitate everyone's right to vote or to constrain that right? So looking back over the whole class series, we began in 1619 in the early years, up through the end of Reconstruction, and then the period called slavery by another name with Black codes and convict leasing and Jim Crow. Then we turned our attention to the 20th century and public policy in the form of housing segregation and the FHA, the Veterans Bill, the GI Bill, Social Security, and moved to the Civil Rights Movement, which had some dramatic effects on our country and on equity. But the backlash continued, and our fourth class focused on mass incarceration and the war on drugs and how Black people are disproportionately impacted by these laws. Last week, voter suppression, then and now, and today, a fundamental question: where do we go from here? Some definitions. The word prejudice is an unfavorable opinion or feeling formed beforehand or without personal knowledge, thought, or reason. So it is not based on experience. It is based on opinions formed typically without personal or direct knowledge. White supremacy is the belief, theory, or doctrine that white people are inherently superior to people from all other racial groups, especially Black people, and are therefore rightfully the dominant group in any society. White supremacists, as we speak of them, tend to be the more violent individuals and groups within our society. But white supremacy is that belief that white people are inherently superior. Racism is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is minority or marginalized. And importantly, racism is a system of prejudice plus power. People speak about racism against white people. Absent the power component, the term simply does not apply. So, in asking ourselves the question, where do we go from here? We start with, what have we learned? How are we affected by this? And as a consequence, what is it that we need to do? So how are we different? What is it that we see differently? And what is it that we individually and collectively can do to make a difference? So we've learned that the institution of slavery created and sustained an underclass of people. And that began even before the founding of the United States, but it was incorporated into all aspects of our governing philosophy once the United States was formed. We learned about segregation, which was the law of the land until 1964, the separate but equal doctrine that perpetuated white supremacy, because separate for sure, equal not so much. And when not equal, it was never a case that the white conditions were worse. And the legacy of that segregation remains, and that legacy is enormous when it comes to knowing one another, to working together, and we'll explore that a little further in a few minutes. We learned about intentional public policy throughout our history that in every regard systematically disadvantaged Blacks in housing, in education, in benefits programs, in criminal justice system, in voting rights. And we know that the roots of today's inequality are deeply embedded in our country and reflected everywhere. So how does this history, learning this history, affect us? There is so much that we never knew or understood. And we need to ask ourselves, why not? Why did we not know? Certainly, the curriculum in history classes are a significant aspect of shaping our knowledge and our beliefs about American history. But the legacy of segregation in all its aspects, but particularly in housing, resulted in such extreme isolation from one another. And if we had no personal knowledge, no personal relationships, again, back to that definition of prejudice, what fills the vacuum where there's not personal experience? And we know that stereotypes flourish. And those stereotypes are intensified by all aspects of the media, not just the news, but movies and TV shows and representations and reflections of different types of people. You know, the cops and robbers, the cowboys and Indians, the black hats and the white hats. It goes on and on. I took a class, I'm not sure if I've mentioned this to you all, but I took a class back in the 70s when I was at DuPont. And our facilitators were two Black men from San Francisco, and they said, you cannot have grown up in the United States in the 20th century and not be prejudiced, because we have been inundated with these messages overtly and subliminally. So it is not a question of do we hold these stereotypes? The question is, what do we do with them? What do we do with them when we recognize them? And so it has led to a condition that is termed implicit bias. It's interesting, in that same class, they began by asking the white managers at whom the class was targeted to list all of the terms that they associated with Black people. There were two Black employees in the class. Their purpose in being there was that when the facilitator said something about what it's like to be Black in America, or what it's like to be in the white ruling class in America, the DuPont managers might be prone to say, well, not here. And the Black employees were there to say, oh yes, here. I'm not sure if I shared with you, but at one point during that class, one of the men from a plant in the South related that the local Ku Klux Klan organization met in the conference room of the plant at the invitation of the plant manager. So in any case, as we began this class and they asked us, what are all the terms that come to mind when you think of Black people? And there was silence. And finally, someone bravely raised their hand and said, exotic. And there was another delay, and someone said, athletic. And someone followed with musical. And then there was silence. And the facilitator said, oh, I'm sorry. We weren't clear on the instructions. We don't want to know what you think. We want to know what you've heard. And we filled 11 chart pads with some of the most pejorative terms: murderer, drug addict, welfare queen. 11 chart pads full of these terms. And I sat there looking at them, and I thought, what must it be like to leave your house every day knowing that the people you encounter are going to have heard these same words, these same terms, and absorbed and adopted them to varying degrees? What must that, what burden must that be? What must that be like? So all of those words burrow themselves into our minds and into our hearts, and they pop out at various points in time. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes they just sit there and they influence and impact the things that we say and the decisions that we make. I related a story yesterday at a white ally group. Sue and Bill Getman were there. With all this work that I have done that began decades ago, I recognize that I still hold biased, prejudiced beliefs, but I thought I had done such a good job, really worked hard. And about a year ago, we had an experience where a tree, a 90-foot tall tree, fell on our house, and it crushed the roof, which had been replaced in full 4 months before. Timing is everything. And it did a fair amount of damage, but it could have been much worse. The issue was that the placement of the tree was such that when they came to remove it, the odds were great that the damage was going to be compounded in trying to get the tree out. And so I was sitting in the living room as the work was going on, and I heard this terrible crash and thought, now what? And I looked up and I saw that the crew chief was white, and I felt better. So it's not do we hold these views, it's what do we do with them when we recognize them. And so this lack of understanding and empathy, a lot of it has to do with not truly, as white people, appreciating what it is like to be Black in America. I have a very dear friend, co-worker for years, one of the most dignified human beings I know, never have seen him in blue jeans. And he relates that there are days, he's 78 years old now, that there are days he cannot bring himself to leave his house. He lives in South Carolina. And there are days he cannot conjure up the mental and the stamina that it takes to go out and confront what he's going to confront. Hard for many of us to imagine that. And so in knowing this history and all of its implications, it requires our taking personal responsibility to act. And so the question is, what's next? Particularly to the white people who are part of this group, we need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's okay. In reality, it's necessary. It's part of what creates growth. And so to begin with a focus on prayer for guidance, for support, for meaningful action, for self-examination, which is not easy, which means reflecting on our own attitudes and behaviors. The need and the opportunity for additional education and dialogue, sharing our thoughts, our questions, our knowledge, and listening, particularly for understanding. Then to take action, to understand what needs to be done, and ask the question, what can I do? And then the personal commitment to say, this is what I will do. So when it comes to self-examination, that requires observation, kind of stepping outside ourselves, watching ourselves, walking in parallel with ourselves to see what we do and what we say. Particularly as we observe ourselves in circumstances and situations where race is a factor. Then reflecting on thoughts and feelings that occur during these times and monitoring our reactions, being self-aware and reshaping our responses. We can't necessarily help the feelings that come to a surface. They're grounded in many aspects of our personal history and experience, and those feelings are feelings. And you can't say you can't have that feeling. Well, yes, indeed, I can. But the question is, what do I do with it? What are the alternatives? And it can be really helpful in this work of self-examination to engage a partner and to have some ground rules that say, I want you to tell me when you see me doing or saying things that, you know, I would wish I hadn't if I had been aware of them. So help me in that process, and I'll help you. And we'll both take a deep breath and put that automatic defensiveness aside and say, I really do want to learn. In terms of education, there are so many books and videos and articles. There are museums to visit. Certainly the African American History Museum in Washington, DC, you cannot do it in one visit. It's extraordinary. And the museums in Alabama, of all places, Birmingham and Montgomery. And classes and discussion groups like these. So I'm just going to hit kind of the top of my list for some recommended books. And one of the things that I have offered to provide are some Google Docs with lists of books and videos and articles and social justice organizations that would be available for everyone, not just to look at, but to add to. So as you see a list of books, if there's 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 that you have read that have been particularly meaningful to you, there'll be an opportunity for you to add those so that it becomes a collective group resource for everybody. America's Original Sin by Jim Wallace was the one that started me on the, not back to 1619, but starting back at the time of writing the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. It's a very thorough history. Between the World and Me is Ta-Nehisi Coates' letter to his adolescent son. And it is a powerful and beautiful piece of work. Carol Anderson, who's an Emory University professor, has written 2 very impactful books. The first is White Rage, about the inevitable backlash that occurs anytime progress is made for African Americans or Blacks in the United States. And One Person, No Vote, which is her 2018 book on voter suppression. The Equal Justice Initiative has a series of books. Since I started doing this series of courses, they published 4 books. They're available online to read, but you can also purchase them. They are beautiful, beautifully bound, illustrated, and they're $2 a piece. And I'm sure they're not done. And so this is an opportunity both to gather that information and to financially support the Equal Justice Initiative. The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander speaks to the mass incarceration issues in the United States. And I believe that for some of you, I think particularly for the Coalition to Dismantle the New Jim Crow, that whole initiative grew out of reading Michelle Alexander's book. Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, who has done so much work with mostly men sentenced to death, living on death row, and the dozens and dozens of people unjustly convicted and sentenced to death who have been released as a result of his group's work. The Warmth of Other Suns was the book by Isabel Wilkerson on the Great Migration. It is a wonderful story, and her book Cast is her most recent one. I'm halfway through that, and it too is a powerful exposition of much of what we've been talking about. And then I'll even go back to the 60s and James Baldwin, who wrote Notes of a Native Son, a whole range of books, but The Fire Next Time is quite extraordinary. And Don Lemon, who is a commentator, I believe on CNN, has written a book that will be released in March called This Is the Fire, which is predicated on James Baldwin's work. And also, Eddie Glaude has just written a book based on James Baldwin's writings as well. So going back to the original texts has been an important part of the learning. In terms of some videos, there's a PBS series called Race, The Power of an Illusion. And it doesn't change a thing about what exists in our society and the racism that exists in our society, but what it does is make perfectly clear that there is no genetic basis to race. There is nothing about being Black or being white that makes you genetically inferior or superior. And for those who have any questions about this, it's quite a good series. Deconstructing White Privilege is a video by Robin DiAngelo. She also wrote White Fragility, which is and she is a wonderful speaker. One of the things that she said in a talk that she gave was recently is that she is no less racist than Donald Trump. And everyone listening to her gasped because of who she is and what she does. But she was making the point that she has been conditioned and socialized by all of the same forces and factors. And the question once again is, what do you do with it? If you go to TED Talks and Google Talks to help you understand racism in America, up pop 25 TED Talks by different people on various aspects. There was both a video series and a book by Emmanuel Acho, who is a former Philadelphia Eagle. I understand the book is excellent, but I watched the videos and they are outstanding, and he does a tremendous job. The video 13th by Ava DuVernay, which relates to the 13th Amendment, what it accomplished and the loopholes that it left open. Good Trouble, the story of John Lewis, and Just Mercy, the movie version of parts of Brian Stevenson's book. Some recommended articles are The History of the Idea of Race, the 4 books that are currently part of the Equal Justice Initiative series. And then I believe we've mentioned this before, The Case for Reparations, which was an article published in The Atlantic in June of 2014 by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And so then we look at the opportunity for more dialogue, for discussion groups that we each can join or could form. The same with book groups, joining one, forming one, or if you're part of one, suggesting a book along these lines that might be helpful for reading and discussion. Working to develop cross-racial relationships. It has been reported that 75% of adult white Americans do not have a single close Black friend. And that makes understanding and awareness and empathy and collaboration extraordinarily difficult. The need to listen for understanding and to speak up, especially when people make racist comments. And been involved in lots of discussion about this and how do you do that? And after the fact you think, oh, I should have said, or I wish I had, because it's been famously said that silence means assent. And so there can be difficult situations that we find ourselves in, and the simple path is not to say anything. But if the consequence of that is that everyone involved thinks that we agree, it leaves the wrong impression. So I had a boss who used to say to me, you're going to encounter difficult circumstances, and what you need to do is anticipate them out of the heat of battle and think about what you're going to do. And so practice what we would say. That's not my experience. I don't agree. I don't agree with that. Actually, and provide a fact, particularly a historical fact that you might have learned somewhere along the line. I used to think that, but I learned. And I read this or I saw that, and I found it really informative or really helpful. So these are not jump down your throat kinds of responses, which I personally find myself inclined to do from time to time, and try really hard to restrain myself, especially because they're members of my family who I would cheerfully strangle if I had the opportunity, but there you go. And importantly, join advocacy groups. There's work we can do individually, but there is power in working together. So choose an issue that matters to you. Find ways where by joining these groups, white and Black people work collaboratively together in partnership to make change happen. Here are some. And there will be a list of these along with website links and other information. Smart Justice Delaware is doing incredible work in trying to address criminal justice reform from a legislative standpoint in Delaware. Witness to Innocence is based in Philadelphia. It is the nearest Innocence Project focused on people wrongly convicted and sentenced to death. The Bars and the Doves are the coalition to dismantle the new Jim Crow. Network Delaware is actually a connection of many of these organizations. The Methodist Action Program is actively involved in initiatives, as is the Delaware Racial Justice Collaborative. Of course, the YWCA's mission is eliminating racism and empowering women. The red equal sign in the circle with all the Black next to it, it's a little tracing of white, but it's the Metropolitan Wilmington Urban League. And just below that, that organization has founded the Wilmington Center for Education, Equity, and Policy, particularly in light of the recent compromise on the settlement of the education suit in Delaware. Building People Power, the Unitarian Universalist Delaware Advocacy Network, the Poor People's Campaign and Reverend William Barber, which is a nationwide organization with a newly forming Delaware chapter, and the Delaware Center for Justice. And so, as I said, we'll provide more information about each of these, what they do, what they're focused on, and the links to connect with them and their work. So join these advocacy groups, seek opportunities to work together, make your voice heard personally, take organization leadership, call your representatives. We keep learning over and over again that one of the benefits of living in a small state like Delaware is that on any given issue, if a representative or a senator hears from 20 people, that makes them pay attention. And so imagine when they hear from a few hundred, the effect that that would potentially have. Consider personal reparations. Patronize Black-owned businesses, restaurants, bakeries, bookstores. There are a range in our community. There are firms in our area that explicitly hire returning citizens, people who have been in prison, who have great difficulty finding employment. Horizon Services is one of these that makes a point of helping returning citizens reacclimate into the job market and then the housing market and back into society as full partners. And then we have the opportunity for continued group interactions. One of the things that happened at the end of the class that was hosted and facilitated by Saints Andrew and Matthew and attended by an almost equal number of Westminster people was the desire to form some small groups of 6 or 8 people to continue meeting and talking and sharing, enhancing our experiences together, continuing our learning, continuing the creation of new relationships. And Sam decided to hold off on forming those small groups to see if there might be people from here, from First and Central, who would be interested in participating in these small groups as well. And so with David Andrews, the pastor at SAM, we'll be looking at gathering email addresses and sending out invitations to everyone to see if you would like to be part of ongoing small group dialogues as we move forward. So the question is, what gets you going? Well, what got me off the couch was the murder of unarmed Black men and youth and boys. Trayvon Martin was 2012. Tamir Rice, 14 years old. Alton Sterling, Stephon Clark, Botham Jean, Laquan McDonald, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Walter Scott, Antoine Rose, Eric Garner, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and most recently, Casey Goodson and Andre Hill, and hundreds and thousands more. And it has been these videos, these visuals that have been so powerful. It is similar to what happened during the Civil Rights Movement, when all of a sudden on our television screens, Americans saw the violence being done in the name of law and order. And now with cell phones and videos, we get to observe these killings, these murders. And just as with the lynching period, when more than 99% of the perpetrators faced no consequences, the same is true today. So I'm going to close with a podcast I saw of Eddie Glaude. He's a professor of African American Studies, head of that department at Princeton University. If you've not heard him speak, I highly recommend that you look to follow him. And he said, he has written this book recently on the writings of James Baldwin. And he said, one of the questions that used to irritate James Baldwin more than any other was when people would say to him, well, what does the Negro want? And he would respond by saying, well, what do you want? You want fairness, you want justice, you want opportunity, you want safety. That's what the Negro wants. And so what is your conception of justice? Should some people be valued more than others, particularly because of the color of their skin? Black people are dying because of racism, because of violence, because of police action, because of health inequity, food deserts, poverty, poor nutrition, access to health care, stress-related comorbidities, maternal and infant mortality. Is that justice? In October 2018, the Census Bureau created a comprehensive census tract level data set covering nearly the entire United States. Life expectancy is a fundamental indicator of inequality. Researchers focus on life expectancy as the broadest possible dimension of privilege. The life expectancy for children born in Centerville, Delaware, exceeds those born in Wilmington near East 12th Street by 18 years. Almost 2 decades. These census tracts are less than 6 miles apart. And so we are called to fight for justice. Let us respond with energy and commitment.
Thank you, Sue. It's an amazing challenge. You have helped equip us, and you've given us resources to do more. And I'm sure that people may have comments or questions. I just thank you again so much for what you've done. So I may be frozen. I don't know. It looks like other people may be, which means I probably am. But if you, I see that Joe and Charlene Bradley have raised their hand. So
Go ahead.
Okay. Sue, I can't thank you enough for the series. And there are two things that I've personal experiences in my life that resonated in particular with this. One is some of the things we saw today. The contrast that can exist in us with using language or social behaviors that we've grown up with unthinkingly, terms that are derogatory, or realizing that, but where one's personal behavior can be different. And I'm thinking about my father. My father owned and ran an Esso station at 7th and Washington Streets in Wilmington for many years. And his right-hand man assistant was an African-American. And this was located basically in a mostly African-American neighborhood in the city. And I remember, as I grew older, I remember being upset by my father using terms that would be derogatory towards Jewish. There were just a lot of expressions, and I know people will think of them, and I don't really want to say them now, but regardless of race, religion, whatever, he just used the language. He was born in 1925, and that's kind of how he grew up with, even though just 2 generations before, his family, being of Irish extraction and having come to America, were also on the receiving end of terms like that. But in his personal behavior, when he decided to leave the Esso company and leave the gas station, he found that the Esso organization, his assistant wanted to take over and run it. And the regional organization office was not going to allow that. They wanted to replace my father with another white man. And my father was so incensed that he went up to Philadelphia and badgered them until they did hire his assistant, his African-American assistant, for that job. And he ran the station for many years after that. So there was this contrast between the slang language I would hear my father say, but the way he actually behaved in his personal life. And I remember many years later when I was, in college and thinking about these things, not calling him on it exactly, but asking him about this contrast. And he was turned out, he was really totally oblivious to the language that he used. He didn't realize that there was this dichotomy, this disparity in those things. And the other thing that I'm thinking is, as many of you know, our grandson is biracial. And this is particularly brought home to me. What I think of as our responsibility to educate ourselves, and so that we can not only make sure that we are providing the same attitudes and loving, which we do feel for him, but also the dangers that he's going to be exposed to as he grows up. And what can we do now to try to work to make things better? So thank you.
Thank you.
Noble, if you have a thought.
I always seem to have a thought. I want to thank Sue also for this wonderful thought-provoking series. Much of what you've discussed has to do with how white people react to racism. I found your reference to the man in South Carolina who had to muster courage to leave the house particularly poignant. Patrick and I live in a 55 plus community, Middletown, which is quite diverse. We have I think maybe mostly white residents. We have a lot of Black residents, Asian residents, etc. We all get along very well. Last year, I referenced this before. There was a woman who I know, she lives 2 doors away. She wanted me to speak at Black History Month in the school. I had written a book. She wanted me to speak to the students, and she tried to make that happen. And I'd see her. We were quite cordial whenever we saw one another. I think I mentioned before that at the pool last summer, she raised in saying, "Oh, they're coming for us, and we can't go to the mall." She was referring to Black people. It was very upsetting. But since that time, she and her husband, 2 doors away, have displayed their MAGA hat every day. They've replaced the bulbs in their outside the garage with the dark blue bulbs. They have one of those American flags with the dark blue stripes. And Patrick and I with the dog walk past that house almost every day. Of course, with COVID, we haven't seen them. I wrestle with how I feel and how I might react when I see this woman and her husband. I would like, I think, to tell them, if I were to see them, that I feel pain when I see those symbols of what I interpret as racism on their porch. It is hurtful to me. It's as hurtful as if they were displaying KKK dress or swastikas. I don't know whether or not they're aware of this, but this is how I feel. But there's a part of me that says, that reacts in anger. There's a part of me that says, if I see them, I'm not going to speak to them. And this is very uncharacteristic to me. I speak to people, I'm cordial, and I've been cordial to them. If I were to see them, I'm not going to speak to them, or I'm going to speak in a very, very curt way and not engage them. And I am struggling with, what do I do? Not what I think the best part of me would do, but what the visceral, real me does when I encounter these people, or when I encounter any of the other Trumpsters or any of those people. What do I do? And it's caused me quite a bit of anxiety. And I think many minority people wrestle with this, because all of the things, or most of the things that Sue has taught, most minority people know to some extent. Maybe not all the details, but we know it and we know how it feels. So I wrestle with, what am I as a Christian and an American to do in the face of this evil, which never seems to get better?
Noble, thank you for sharing that. That's, well, few of us, most of us on this call would not be able to fully grasp that. I mean, we could maybe have a sense of the anger, but to know that kind of visceral fear and pain and hurt that you've experienced. Thank you for sharing it with us, and we will continue to dialogue so that maybe we together can work on responses that will support you. Are there any other thoughts this morning?
Well,
Oh.
sorry, I didn't raise my hand, but I think what Noble's bringing up, and Noble, thank you for sharing, is why we need white allies, and what white allies offer, so that it's not just Noble wrestling with, how do you talk to somebody who, your neighbor with the MAGA hat, that all of us probably have neighbors with MAGA hats. I know that I have one across the street. And I think that it's a dilemma that I struggle with, but I think that Noble, hearing how it affects you, I think creates more of a sense, more empathy, and more urgency in me.
Thank you, Sarah. Sue Linderman referenced the group that Bill and I started yesterday with the YWCA is offering a 10-part program for white allies, and it's a study program. We'll be meeting once a month. We started yesterday and it'll be for 10 months. And we're fortunate that in one of these groups that Sue Linderman is our leader. So we feel very grateful about that. But we would have the opportunity to establish one of those groups at First and Central through the YWCA. And so I think that's something that we will look into. It is primarily for white people to learn how to respond to racism and to take action. So I will continue to, we'll experience it, but we'll also explore the opportunity. And Bill is going to be in touch with David at Sam about the small group connections. So we have 2 more comments. We'll do those. We'll have Lyle and Terry, and then Jana, and then we will finish. So Lyle and Terry, I'll give you the floor.
I wanted to promote, and I see it's already promoted, that we at First and Central be part of a dialogue. And eventually, I hope that dialogue will include our African American friends from African American churches, because I don't think we do as much as we could in isolation of white people trying to figure out how to be allies. I think we need to also be in dialogue with some of our brothers and sisters in African American churches, so they can tell us how to be allies, what is important to them, and how we can be supportive. Ibram Kendi has a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And one of the things that he says in the book is, join with us when we are fighting for policies, and they know the policies in the legislature that are coming up, and they need help, they need support, they need tangible support. Yes, we need to change our attitudes, but we need to be on the front lines doing those things to be helpful. So when we dialogue, we need the input of those people who are on the front lines fighting. And I also wanted to say that it was easier for me, Noble, to confront back years ago when our daughter was having a birthday party. And I insisted that the only little Black girl in the group be invited to her birthday party. There were mothers in that group who would not let their children come to the birthday party because the little Black girl was coming. And I discovered that one of the women who was fighting it the most was a Jewish woman. I never met her personally, but I gave her a real tongue lashing on the phone. And I said, you know, how can you be this way? Da, 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 da. Well, Noble, it was easier for me because I had never met her. I just knew what she was doing to sabotage that birthday party. And I just gave her a real tongue lashing. So anyhow, I pity you having to look someone face to face and call them out, but it has to happen in
Well,
some
We
form
do
or
all-
another.
Yes, so thank you, Terry. Lyle, I'm gonna need to go to Jana. I'm sorry. Jana?
This is real quick. I just wanted to add to the category of firms who hire returning citizens. We have a friend who works at Second Chances Farms. You can Google it. And it's a for-profit organization to solve a nonprofit problem, which is employing people who are returning citizens. And they're doing a great job of that. So if you want to support them, it would be wonderful. It's a indoor urban farming, vertical farming on racks that are 20 feet high. And they supply restaurants, grocery stores. They've done a really great job. They're in about their third year now and have gotten some good grants and could use your support.
In terms of supporting them, all of their employees are returning citizens.
Yeah.
And because of COVID, when they began, they had contracts with grocery stores and restaurants, but when restaurants and things shut down, the demand was reduced. And so they actually will provide these organic produce greens to individuals. And so you actually can support them by buying their product directly. So it's one more way to help.
And they deliver right to your doorstep.
Yes. Yes, and one of the things that Sam asked about in the chat was a list of Black-owned businesses. So when we make the Google Docs available, we'll ask for your contributions to that.
I just want to say how grateful I am for the opportunity to spend this time with you. Thank you very much.